Okay, hey class. This is the 3:30 recording, the first of the listed ones, but not the first in the playlist, obviously. This recording is going to focus on two things. Primarily, what it says above me, counter arguments, right, which we talked briefly about last time we met. The other thing it's going to really quickly do is run over the things we talked about right before spring break, just as a refresher. So we'll start with that. First things first. Unlike a lot of previous assignments that we've done in this class, this assignment is a full paper, right? We don't have labeled subsections and things of the like, right? We'll have an introduction that ends with a thesis. We'll have a body, which, as we talked about before, the 5-paragraph essay doesn't exist, right, in any practical sense. You can have as many sections as you need to convey your point, okay? And then you'll have a conclusion that ends with a call to action, which again is that idea of we put the ball in the other team's court, right? So if there's somebody who can actually enact our solution, for example, which should be the target audience of this paper anyway, somebody who can get something done towards this, we are pushing them to actually go do what we've suggested, okay? The other thing that we talked about is kind of that organizational setup of how a paper like this might be arranged, okay? So for example, we might have, let's say for a hypothetical, we have three body sections, right? Obviously a little close to the idea of a 5-paragraph essay, but it's just really easy for this particular example, okay? We'll have our introduction, ends with our thesis, right? And remember, we talked about our thesis. It should have 2 points, right? It should give me a roadmap of everything that we're about to cover, and it should provide an arguable point, right? If it does both those things, you'll get full credit, okay? But we get to that middle section, and we're like, damn, we have to figure out how to arrange these in such a way that they're as effective as possible, rhetorically engaging, okay? What we understand here, and we've talked about before, is that people tend to remember the ends and the beginnings of things. The middle loses a little bit of fidelity in the memory. It gets a little fuzzy, right? But the ends and the beginnings tend to be very concrete, which is why in most essay formats you have some restatement of the thesis at the end to also go along with the beginning, right? That tends to be why we organize things that way. But with that in mind, we need to understand we want the party walking away from this essay with the impetus to actually go enact the change to have in their head that they should have your strongest points in mind as they go. So obviously we want to push our stronger points towards the end and the beginning then, okay? So let's say we have 1, 2, and 3, and we rank them in terms of confidence that we have in them as argumentative points, 1, 2, and 3, okay? From 1 strongest, 2 middle, 3 weakest, okay? We discussed and decided that the best way we could probably arrange those, we have intro and thesis, and then we do like 2, then we do 3, then we do 1, and then we do our conclusion. The reason we decided on that was, well, you want the two of the stronger ones towards the end. You want to bury the weakest one in the middle, because people tend to pay less attention, fair, right? But also you want the strongest one to be towards the end because you want people to walk out of the long paper with that in mind, okay? There's one extra wrinkle, which is what this video is about, that we're gonna talk about, which is outlined on the rubric as a thing that you need to do, which is effectively deal with counter arguments, okay? What a counter argument is can have a couple different flavors. We have the basic sort of opposing side argument, for example. That solution will not work. Okay, well, obviously they're not on your side, they're the opposite side, very easy to identify. But there's some other things we can look at as possibilities for what we deem as counter arguments here that make sense, okay? Remember, we're not just arguing for a solution, we're arguing that our solution is the best possible solution, okay? So somebody is suggesting, for example, another way of doing it, that's a counter argument. You can explain why that one won't quite work, right? Or, yeah, yours is close, but what if we change this thing? No. I have the best possible way. Let me explain it to you, okay? All of those are counter arguments. A very common one you guys will think of, for example, is someone saying, how are we going to pay for this, right? That is also a thing. Like, but have you thought about anything that's trying to chip holes in your argument are counter arguments we can deal with. And your job is to kind of pick out the one that seems the most upfront and obvious, or potentially the most problematic if left unattended, and deal with it, okay? Thankfully, we have a toolbox of ways to deal with those things, okay? The first is pretty simple, right? At least in description, all right? The first thing we can do is just, they say this is the thing, and you just say no and explain why, right? Direct counter argument, okay? Like, they have proposed option A, and you're like, option A does not work, and here are the reasons why. Great, okay? Like, you've settled it as long as the information you're using to back yourself up and explaining why that source doesn't work, perfect, okay? Then we have ones that are a little bit more complicated and we have to think about more, okay? There's the reality that sometimes somebody will make an argument against you and you're just going to be like, shit, they're kind of right, all right? Like, that's a bit to deal with, okay? So we have to think about that for a minute and then go, well, let's mitigate the damage as much as possible, because sometimes, in fairness, we can't fully get rid of another argument without damaging our ethos, without damaging our credibility by essentially just being false, right? And we don't want that. We want our reader to believe us as experts and that we have credibility behind what we're saying. So the other opportunity we often have is essentially yes, but. It's like, yeah, that point you brought up is interesting, but what you're not considering is, and then throw in another mitigating circumstance, right? It's the what if, right? But whataboutism is a common way it's described in political discussion. But the thing is, it can be an effective way of at least shifting some emphasis off of the argument at hand that might be damaging to you otherwise if you don't deal with it. Okay? The third way of dealing with it, and it by far the weakest, right, is this idea that you just kind of don't talk about it, right? It's not an option for us here, right? Because it's not an effective way of dealing with counterargument. If you, in my suggestion, if you run into a counterargument here that specifically is just, oh wait, they're right, like my thing doesn't work because of this thing they said, pick another counterargument to deal with, because you can't deal with that one. The real world application is sometimes people just ignore problems, right? It's not an effective way of dealing with it, but it is technically in the toolbox, so it's worth bringing up. There is one last little thing I want us to go over, which are oftentimes problems that people run into in dealing with counterarguments, okay? And sometimes there are things that the counterargument you're looking at is employing against you, so it can be interesting to know about these, right? There's a wide range in the science of arguing, right, in logic, right, of these things called logical fallacies, right, which are common misconceptions or mistakes people make in thinking that, you know, two things, that things work in a specific way when they don't actually work that way if you reason it out, okay? Common flaws, all right? The first and most common mistake in arguing is something called an ad hominem argument. That's when instead of arguing the point, you're arguing against the arguer, right? Now, that's very different, for example, than suggesting that the person doesn't have the ethos to talk about that. That's technically ad hominem, but might be applicable in a given situation, right? You know, like, this guy's talking about this, he doesn't know nothing about it, right? Current politics, there's plenty of people who are like, why is the president talking about, you know, like, what medicines you should be using when, you know, doctors should be saying that the president doesn't know about this. So ad hominem, but not always inaccurate. Still, launching into an ad hominem argument when there's a point still on the table, right, that hasn't been dealt with, is viewed as oftentimes essentially conceding the argument, right? So for example, if we look at that political thing, you have a lot of, the political example I just gave with the president suggesting particular medications, you have medical experts saying, no, this does not work because of this reason. Also, why is the president doing this? They're broaching it as a new subject, as opposed to not dealing with the actual content of the argument and instead just only attacking the arguer, right? So for example, don't resort to name calling and so on and so forth with the arguments. Deal with the argument itself, right? After that, you can suggest, for example, that the people making that argument have ulterior motives or things like that. That's totally valid, but you can't leave their point unattended, right? If you do, you're kind of falling into that yes but territory, and you have to be very careful with it. Okay, because anyone who understands how arguments will work will just be like, wait a minute, like you're not making a valid argument against their point. You're just saying that they're not, like you're insulting them essentially, which has nothing to do with the argument itself. Okay. The other one that I really, really intensely want you guys to think about, and I'm almost certain you've heard it in high school before, but if not, it's fine. We're talking about it now. Is this idea of correlation not equaling causation. Okay, causation is simple, right? A makes B happen, right? Correlation, by comparison, is whenever A happens, we often see B, right? There's no direct link. We can't see A lead into B, right? Just because B is around does not necessarily mean that A is causing B. They just happen to be around together, okay? That's a very common flaw. I'll tell you that when you move on to, for example, if you try and do graduate school or any professional things, law school, anything of the sort, the essay sections love to try to make you make this mistake, okay? You need to point out, for example, if someone makes an argument where they're saying like, yes, but if we make more public transit, there's more people will get robbed. It's like, well, wait, hold on. Like, where are you getting this? And they're like, well, like most of the public transit, these robberies during this certain time period happen on public transit. And if we add more public transit, then obviously it means we add more robberies. It's like, well, no, that's correlation, right? The public transit isn't causing the robberies. There's a whole bunch of other societal problems behind that. It's just that, when there's public transport, there tend to be people in the place, and when there tend to be people in the place, the more people in the place, the more likely you are to run into a person who has a criminal intent, let's say, right? Who knows, right? But as you can see, like the public transit isn't causing the robberies. It's just they happen to show up in similar instances, right? So it's an interesting thing to consider. A lot of counter arguments can be defeated by pointing out that that's the case, but also don't fall into that trap yourself and look through your arguments and make sure you're not making that mistake as you go, okay? I want to wrap this up because I don't want to keep these too long, right? Remember to post a draft in the discussion board by midnight tonight, as I put in the email, right, of what I asked you to do. And then by Wednesday at midnight, go in and comment on somebody's, okay? And then those will both go in as participation or homework grades. If you have any questions about your paper or you have a specific thing you want me to look at, you post it up in a draft, we can talk. That's the benefit of this arrangement. It's very easy to schedule time for us to have a conversation remotely. So with that being said, stay safe, wash your hands and everything. Dalton says hi. This is the third time I've had to record this. He got very mad at birds both other times. So here you go. All right. Thanks, guys. I'll have another recording up for you next week.